Um, Good morning, everyone, and I want to welcome you again to our discussion forum for this week. And if you've been following us for a while, we started the forum on 23rd April for this year, and so far we've had alumni, the Center for Human Rights alumni, discuss several topical issues as it relates to human rights, especially within the African region, and how they have been impacted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had conversations on socioeconomic rights. We've had conversations on vulnerable groups in the region. We've also had conversations on the United Nations human rights architecture and how so far they've been able to, in one way or the other, um, do one or two things with respect to ameliorating the impact of the pandemic in the region. But today, we'll be speaking specifically to the impacts of technologies on human rights, especially during the pandemic. And my responsibility here today is just to ideally moderate. I will be introducing the speakers to you shortly. But the main idea behind this is just to have the important conversations that are necessary with respect to how technology so far have either, made the impact of the pandemic more bearable or had made it worse. So I will be introducing the speakers for today. The first speaker would be Dr. Thompson Chengata, who is the European Research Council Fellow on AI ethics at the University of Southampton and also a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford. Also, we have Mary Stella Simiyu, who is currently a doctoral student and also a project officer at the Expression, Information, and Digital Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights, University of Victoria. Then lastly, we'll be having Dr. Ololade Shailon, the Privacy Policy Manager for Middle East and Africa at Facebook. And before we go to the first speaker, who is Dr. Thompson, I would also like to state my name. My name is Tomiwa Ilori, and I am the alumni coordinator, and I also work with the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights. So, like I said, I'll be moderating today's session. Over to you now, Dr. Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the introductions and for the invitation to this important topic during COVID-19 pandemic. So before I start my presentation, which is to do with access to internet in these times and whether that particularly is an issue of a want or a need, I would want maybe to start by sharing my screen. Just a moment. I'm not sure if you are now seeing my screen.
I can see, and I think everyone can also see.
Okay, thank you very much. So in general, when I'm dealing with this topic, my approach, if you are seeing my screen now, is to look at this, what I'm calling the right to internet access during COVID-19 lockdowns in Africa, and particularly, and also during that discussion to try and explain whether, human rights and digital ethics, so to say, can work as a governance framework. And I'll be discussing mainly two strands in that regard. First, to do with access to internet as a human right, and secondly, after someone is, successfully, or if someone was to successfully access the internet, so to say, as a right, how they are acting on internet or online. These are like the individual duties when exercising that right to internet access. And as you may have seen, I may start by saying that, as to why I have included, for example, the issue of digital ethics in this discussion, which ordinarily would seem like a legal discussion is that I, as a trained lawyer and like many other legal scholars, used to think or continue to think sometimes that the law is a panacea in dealing with social problems such as those created by digital technologies and access to internet. Yet, for the years that I've worked in the artificial intelligence field and on legal matters and ethics, so to say, I've recognized that the law, only provides us sometimes with the bare minimum. That if you want to attain the maximum possible, you perhaps have to turn to other fields such as ethics. So, starting with the access to internet as a human right, I think it is important to note that what has been the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns on the exercise and enjoyment of human rights in general in Africa, so to say. And this is where I say the enjoyment, of human rights, particularly in Africa and other parts of the world, is dependent on freedom of movement, on access to information, and sometimes accessing the government offices if, for example, your rights are not being fulfilled. Yet during these lockdowns, it's common cause that these forms of access are severely restricted, which makes access to internet very, very critical as far as articulating your rights, so to say. So it is at this point that I want to mention then that already briefly, the right of access to internet has been recognized, or it continues to be emphasized by many scholars and other regional bodies such as the African Commission, as far as it has links, for example, to the right to access to information and freedom of expression. For example, the special rapporteur, upon the recommendations that were given by the African Commission, the African Union in their resolutions to revise the declaration, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, particularly notes that states, and I'm quoting him verbatim, that shall recognize that, the universal, equitable, affordable, and effective access to the internet is necessary for the realization of freedom of expression, access to information, and the exercise of other human rights. And he also says that the exercise of the right to freedom of expression and the right of access to information shall be protected from interference, that is both online and offline, which means, or which gives reference to the aspect of access to internet, so to say. And lastly, there's also an emphasis to say that states, when they are looking at the right to freedom of expression, shall interpret it to include the enjoyment of right of freedom of expression on the right of access to information in their digital dimensions. And when we're talking about digital dimension, this is where we are including, the aspect of access to internet. So in this particular regard, I have no doubt in my mind that, the right to access internet is and should be recognized or continue to be recognized as a right, particularly in these times of COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, having said that, the point which I then want to say is that, I want to give some sort of examples during COVID-19 where access to internet is, been shown to be the medium through which other human rights are being exercised or enjoyed. And I have 3 examples which I want to discuss. And being from Zimbabwe, I just want to give examples from Zimbabwe, the 3 which I'm referring to. The first one, which I say that access to internet is directly linked to the right to health. It's common cause that, information regarding COVID-19, for example, which places not to go, where to access certain goods and services, have been largely shared on the internet. And for those who may not be having access to internet, particularly for folks who do not have that access or who are in remote areas or in rural Zimbabwe, so to say, there is a limitation then, or some sort of limitation on how then they enjoy their right to health, so to say. I would also want to mention the second aspect of, or before I go to the second example, I would add to this that, in relation to the accessing on internet vital information relating to health and the right to health, so to say, there's been a recent launch of what is known as the Africa Medical Supply Platform. You may have heard about it by the African Union, relating to where governments and other organizations can actually be able to purchase, medical supplies that relate to COVID-19. And for me, when I saw that the moment it was posted on African Union website, for example, this is where you see that, okay, when you do have access to internet, you immediately get sometimes, or many times, so to say, information that is critical in these times where we are in. Then the second aspect, or the second example, which I want to give also from Zimbabwe, is that, access to internet has been critical in as far as fighting corruption that is related to COVID-19. In Zimbabwe, some weeks ago, because of access to internet and online journalism, or citizen journalism, so to say, online, we have seen that after the Zimbabwean government, including the first family itself, were involved in a scandal relating to goods and services that were meant for COVID-19, externalization of funds which were meant for fighting COVID-19, what is popularly now started to be known as the drug scandal, or the drugs gate, so to say. Most of this anti-corruption movement and protestation, so to say, happened online. And it is individuals, it has not been for example, if it has not been for that access to internet, which at least allowed to, the citizens to some extent to be able to demand from the government to account for what was happening, because they were interfering, so to say, with the right to health by engaging in corruption and externalizing funds that are meant for COVID-19. This is where you see the importance of access to internet in these particular times. And the last example also, which I would give in terms of why access to internet is linked to other rights and is important, is the idea that there are also some unscrupulous government. Unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say at this point that my government may also fall in these types of government that one may refer to as unscrupulous, to say they may engage in activities that are meant, for example, for citizens to participate, for example, changing of the constitutions, where for you to be able to change a constitution, you need constitutional consultations for citizens to participate. Yet, because the government was more interested in changing some of these constitutional provisions without adequate participation from citizens, they chose, for example, to do it during the time of COVID-19 lockdowns, where they know that no one will be able to confront and protest some of those changes. But you'd see that with access to internet, again, people will be sharing the information as to regards what the government is trying to change, and where, for example, people can be lodging their complaints. Having given those examples and emphasized the point that access to internet is critical, or is a right in terms of COVID-19 lockdowns, I want now to say that in the event, or for those who are able to access internet, I should also maybe mention the aspect of duties and rights, where now one is online, particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic. It's again common cause that, since the lockdowns, COVID-19 lockdowns, people spend more time online, and when people spend more time online, I'm asking the question to say that, from in this virtual world, which many people are now living in, are we, for example, away, so to say, from African virtues? Does it mean that some of the ethos that binds us in the physical world, now that we're spending more time online, are no longer applicable? And in that regard, the special rapporteur on the freedom of expression, again, is mentioned that, when it comes to this particular rights, states shall adopt, for example, laws, policies, and other measures to promote affordable access to internet to protect users from online harm. And we see that within this COVID-19 lockdowns, there's been an increase actually in terms of uh, the, the, the type of harm that you find online. And before I mention or I give examples of those online hates that we've been experienced during these lockdowns, I want to refer to why I'm referring particularly to the aspects of saying that we have duties, even if we have rights when we have access to the internet. And this, I'm also plucking it, for example, from Article 27 to 29 of the African Charter on individual duties. We are a unique continent, as you may know, that we are one of perhaps, with the enabling African Charter on Human Rights, which has also duties. And it particularly mentions that, it is an individual, or before I even try to quote that, if you look at in particular, sorry to say, Article 29, subsection 7, it has got echoes of African communitarian ethos, so to say, where it provides particularly that every individual or the individual has a duty to preserve and strengthen positive African cultural values in his relations with other members of the society in the spirit of tolerance, dialogue, and consultation, and in general, to contribute to the promotion of moral well-being of society. And again, in terms of Article 29.8 of the same African Charter, it is said that the individual also has a duty to contribute to the best of his abilities at all times and at all levels to the promotion and achievement of African unity. Yet, what you see is that there's been increased cases of online net, in particular, if I were to give examples of in Zimbabwe and in South Africa of the xenophobia yet online. And this was actually contributed by what started with government officials from South Africa, for example, having discriminatory stances such as plaza shops are going to remain open, but only those that are owned by South Africans. And there were no specific reason, the differentiation between why such policies were being made. And the second one being the mentioning of the idea that we're going to build a fence and erect a fence on the Zimbabwean South African border to avoid people who are infected coming in. And at the point when those suggestions are being made, Zimbabwe actually had the lowest compared to the numbers of infections in South Africa. What that translated into, we see now the developing of some time disinformation online, particularly on Twitter, where we had, I think in the past week, trending hashtags which are hateful. For example, the Zimbabweans must fall, the Nigerians must fall hashtags. And if you if you go on those hashtags and look at them, you see information such as people complaining that they've not been able to get COVID-19 relief because the government of South Africa is putting foreigners, undocumented, immigrants and drug lords first to get that relief. And everyone is retweeting that, and there's this already hype of hate towards a particular community. And it is in this regard that, of course, one can mention that there is law that deals with issues of hate online. But as I have mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, and I'm moving towards my end of discussion, that the law provides the minimum. And why I say this is because, for example, if you were to look at the 2019 case, end of 2019 case of Kwelane versus South African Human Rights Commission, it clearly distinguished actually the aspect to say what is only prohibited by law is hateful speech, not hateful, the latter one. To simply say that someone can actually say something which is hateful, which may be even against, for example, African ethos, African communitarian ethos of how we live, something which is, for example, been realized or recognized in the African Charter to say we should be promoting African unity, tolerance, and living as a community. But as far as the law is concerned, there are certain messages which you can find online, which can be actually harmful, which can actually be hateful, but as long as they do not reach the standard or the minimum standard which the law requires of symbol to say it should be hate speech, then you won't be able to prohibit that. This is where I actually then think that you can have a better better chances of having a higher standard or attaining the maximum if we start also emphasizing the issue of Afro-digital ethics on how people relate to each other online. And when I'm saying Afro-digital ethics, generally you're referring to the aspect where we are saying that digital ethics relate to how we communicate, how we relate with each other online in a morally or ethically acceptable manner. And when you refer now to Afro-digital ethics, you are referring to those digital ethics that are primarily inspired by African philosophy, by African ethics, and some of these, although they may not be the same across the continent, they've commonalities in as far as the idea that us as Africans, we've always operated with Ubuntu, to say, treat the other one as a brother, treat the other one as a sister. In general, as my ending statement, with those African ethos, we even say or conceptualize a human being by their good behavior or how they treat other humans. To the extent that, for example, in my country, if you're not being a good member of a community, someone can actually say Ausimun, as to say Ausimun, meaning you're not a person, as in the way you are acting is against being humane. So if those same approach were to be used online, because it seems it is lacking now, generally because of what other African philosophers have noted, to say there's an assumption that when someone is online, that they don't have responsibility. There's no immediate accountability for your actions. So people start behaving in any way they can. And perhaps it may be important to adopt the approach with the University of Pretoria through the Information Excellence Center, for example, where we say there should be educational tools and Afro-digital ethics being taught to people right from the beginning. And the comparative approach on digital ethics and regulation of social media, for example, of what the UK Center of Data Ethics and Innovation and the Alan Turing Institute are doing, may be helpful in regulating how we are relating with each other online during these difficult times. I would want to end on that. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to say this.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation, Dr. Chengeta. And before we go on, we would as we go on, we will be having a number of polls where participants would kindly help to complete, and it's to help us do our in-house evaluation as an organization. And thank you as you complete those. Next on the schedule is Maristela Simiyu, who will be speaking to us on the role of technologies on democratization during the COVID-19 pandemic. Very enlightening. And so now we are moving to the questions, and I would like to say thank you to our speakers and also to our participants. We have participants from Cameroon, from Uganda, from Mauritius, and from India, and also from the rest of the world. And moving now on to the questions. Like I had said earlier, my first question would go to Dr. Chengeta. So my first question would be, like I had pointed out earlier, one of the fathers of the internet had said that due to the fact that there is a high bar for something to be considered a human right, and in his view, human rights, the internet access for now can be, be referred to, can be considered as a substantive right, rather it's an enabling one. And given your presentation so far, would you perhaps have any response to that? Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic is raising the bar so high that it's now in the clouds that we need to now start considering the internet as a human right? Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, you can hear me now, right? Okay, thank you very much, Tommy, for the question. Before I answer it, I was noting also some questions that were directed to me. Would you allow me to address them now after addressing your question?
That is fine. That is fine. It's okay.
Okay. So in answering your question, I think what I would basically say is that in addition to the reasons why, which I've noted or explained, why the right to access to or access to internet should be conceived as a right, and also the jurisprudence of what has gone, especially in the African continent, from the African Commission and other regional bodies, in explaining why, for example, access to internet is part of the right to freedom of expression and access to information. I would say that his opinion, of course, everyone can freely express themselves on what they see, certain things. But I would want to give you an example. You would agree with me that at a certain time, in the history, there were people, for example, who didn't think, for example, the right to vote is a right, who believed that only certain people were allowed or should be allowed to vote, or other people don't have. But those opinions change over time. So it is critical, I think, to realize at this particular point in time that we are in different times than what we may have perceived to say. Access to internet should not be realized or recognized as a right. But in the current moment in particular, where you find that there is a clear link or direct link between the exercise of certain rights and access to internet, it is really fundamental that it is recognized as such, or that jurisprudence or courts across the globe or governments across the globe recognize it as such. Now, allow me to address some of the questions that I've seen, which were directed to me. The first one, I think there was a person, Mahima, who considers, or who said that the right to access to internet cannot, for example, be seen as a right, or as a right if there is no technical know-how on how to use the internet or the technologies that are associated with that. I would particularly agree on the aspect to say that technical know-how and knowledge of how to use these technologies is fundamental. It is actually part of the right to access to internet, because if you were to look at the comments or the revised declaration on access to information in Africa, which was done by the Special Rapporteur regarding freedom of expression, he particularly actually noted the government obligation to be able to train, its citizen and everyone else on how to use these digital technologies, because it's critical in exercising this particular right. Then there was a question which was posed by Nakili Fitz. Please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. You asked on one of the examples which I gave to say, has there been online harassment of whistleblowers online regarding the corruption associated, for example, with COVID-19? Yes, there have been actually. I can give you examples. For example, Wopo Chingono, who was leading the unearthing of what is known as the drug scandal, this company called Drugs, which was a fictitious company formed by a friend of the first family to loot funds which were meant for COVID-19. The spokesperson of ZANU-PF, the ruling party, and also another group within that party, came online and also published in form of videos where they particularly attacked these particular individuals and warning them with uncertain threats to say that they should desist from dragging the name of the first family in the mud. And what you would note actually there, which is really also an issue of ethics and disinformation, you find that the government, that particular moment when they are threatening the likes of Wopo, they completely deny links to the person who formed drugs, to say we don't know him, he's not part of whatever, we don't even have any personal or business relationship with him. Later on online, we see photos of him being with the first lady, with the president, of him being with the sons of the president, and then the issue changes again. So this is again an issue of ethics on the part of government as far as the information that you give to your citizens. You also find that there are also abusive tweets, on Twitter, of those who are condemning this kind of corruption related to COVID-19. And we have ministers, the recently fired minister, Energy Mutodi, who, for example, for those who were campaigning or protesting against this corruption, we find them being kidnapped, tortured, and then sexually assaulted by government officials and then dumped in a certain city. And you have a minister of the government coming online and making fun of that particular incident, showing complete dissent or discouragement and saying hateful information to say, oh, maybe there were some disagreements with their boyfriend, god partners, that the ones who abused them, certain things like that. And when you see that information like that coming online from these government officials, someone could say, this doesn't qualify as prohibited hate speech. And it doesn't. You wouldn't be able to pin it that on as far as the law is concerned. This is where I was emphasizing to say the importance of digital ethics and how actually we relate to each other as humans. And there's also been the use of ghost accounts from the likes of Matigari and others who constantly try to derail efforts of trying to fight against corruption related to COVID-19. Lastly, sorry, Tommy, for taking a bit of time. I would want actually to ask questions to my co-panelists, if you may please allow me. The first question, just one question for each. The first question to Dr. Ololade Shilun on misinformation and disinformation relating to COVID-19. I just wanted to know, there has been conflicting information from medical experts on the matter. For example, how to approach the issue of COVID-19, or whether if, for example, it is what people say it is, in terms of some medical doctors and associations in the United States. So in terms of information ethics, sorry for again dragging you to ethics, in terms of information ethics, how do governments and organizations like yours choose which information to share and to what degree, So the information on COVID-19, which people are sharing to say this is the correct information, are coming from a group of medical experts, and the other medical experts who are saying the opposite. How do you make that ethical decision? What is the moral reasoning behind to say this one is the one which I'm going with? Because us, perhaps, as people who are accessing the information, we're not experts in that, and experts in that particular whatever are saying two different things. And secondly, there are currently development of AI algorithms that can automatically, for example, detect and delete certain information online. And these are like largely discussed, for example, by the Alan Turing Institute here in the United Kingdom. And, ethically speaking, would you be all right, or would you be okay, for example, with such algorithms deleting certain information which may be deemed inaccurate, as far as COVID-19 is concerned? I know, like, currently sometimes just flagging, how about just saying, I detect that this information is inaccurate, and then the algorithm automatically deletes that particular information. And lastly, my question to Mary is, political currency of many opposition parties is in protest, particularly this idea of taking protests to the streets, especially on issues of disagreements. Do you think in these COVID-19 lockdowns particularly, is it ethically acceptable or ethically fair to take measures for the government of the day, to take measures that are politically contentious, or provoking to opposition parties, political parties, knowing fully well that they cannot be able to protest on them, or use their political currency of protesting in the streets because they are lockdown measures? Those would be my questions. Thank you very much for the time given.
Thank you so much, Thompson, for your questions. And also, to be able to save time, I will advise that our other two speakers also maybe take note of a number of questions in the group chat. For example, particularly questions from Pascal and Jean to Mary Stella on the issue of inclusion when it comes to digital campaigns, and what impact that would have in fairness and free, in fairness and for free elections, considering that physical voting won't be possible given our current realities. How do we ensure inclusion? For example, Pascal had mentioned maybe in rural areas where what they have access to most of the time is traditional media, and they don't have access to the internet. How do we ensure that the internet also carries along everyone, and reflects the wishes of everyone at the same time. And for Dr. Shylon, in addition to what Dr. Tom Chengeta had said, just be grateful if you can kindly consider a question from Lauren Schaffner, who is asking what the oversight mechanisms are in place by Facebook to make sure that the right to privacy is preserved. And if we have more time, we can take more questions, but that will be all for now. Thank you so much.